is an important function of the board. The choice of CEO will depend on the strategic focus of the board and owners of the business at any particular point in the life of the company, depending on whether the emphasis is on growth of market share or optimum profit growth or a bit of both. By same token, for a board chairman, it will be great to have someone with experience in managing people and businesses and can earn the respect of not just other board members, but also members of executive management, as well as the stakeholder community. I'll talk more about stakeholder community later on. To be successful and effective, the board and the executive management have to operate within specific mandates, which should usually be clearly defined and understood. And this may quite often differ from one type of business enterprise or the other. Like I stated earlier, a clear understanding of the goals and aspirations of the business owners is crucial for both board and management in crafting the short, medium, and long-term business plans for the company. Of course, the executive management is under the leadership of a CEO and is vested primarily with the responsibility of day-to-day management of the core business of the organization for profit and for value creation. Executive management team is further challenged in a post-COVID era to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the employees. This is particularly important, and the executive management must recognize and respect the critical oversight role of the board of directors in ensuring that the organization is well run and meets set targets and expectations. The board's primary role, on the other hand, is to provide high-level oversight on the operations of the company on behalf of the shareholders and stakeholders of the company. I'd like to also state here that in modern definitions, the role of the board, especially for large corporates, actually goes beyond protecting the interest of the shareholders of the company and extends to the interest of other stakeholders. The board, in order to ensure a very good organization, must make sure that the CEO is accountable for ensuring that the business is run in the most ethical manner, that taxes are paid on a timely basis, that laws of the land are adhered to, business risks are within the risk appetite or limits set by the board or the owners of the business, that the executive management, of course, does not overpay themselves, that staff members are fairly treated. There is also the aspect of ensuring good return on investment to shareholders in terms of value and of profit, and stakeholders, to ensure that stakeholders are happy with the performance of the company. I've made mention of stakeholders many times earlier. And the reason is that there are other people apart from the owners of the business that are interested in making sure that the business is run well and that is alive and well. Investors in the stock of the business will be number one in that list. Number two will be governments, including state, federal, and local governments. The third would be lenders, like the banks and financial institutions that get involved in the business. And the third will be staff and their families. Of course, staff will also be anxious that the company is well run and is doing what it's supposed to do to ensure that it lives for a long time and does not go down. There are various types of board structures depending on the size of the company or the area of business. In all cases, however, the value of a competent and well-informed board is inestimable. And in saying that, I like to say that the first step in having an effective board is in selecting the right people as members of the board. The ideal board that will have members comprising of subject matter experts in diverse areas and are carefully selected based on the value they are likely to bring to bear on the business. The ideal board, therefore, will comprise of members that are able to decipher the issues that will be tabled to the board from time to time for discussion and are able to ask relevant questions, especially at board committee levels when issues are usually dissected in more detail. Such board members should have character, be independent in thinking, and have courage to give their point of view. Not once, should not be board members that constantly go with the general flow or popular flow at meetings. Also, it might also be important to state that boards lose respect when the executive management sees board members as bench warmers. And when it is obvious that they do not read board documents sent to them and therefore are unable to ask relevant questions and proffer useful suggestions. The ideal board must be bold, courageous enough to provide adequate oversight. It must be a board that does not questions the actions of the executive management, and a board that is not in the position to do that may sometimes be regarded as a danger to the organization. Board members must therefore resist temptation of accepting too many board directorships. A member must voluntarily opt out from the board when either he or she is not enjoying the job, does not have the time to peruse board papers, or feels inadequate to meet the expectations of the shareholders. I'd like to also continue to emphasize that a board is as effective as what its component members bring to the business of the board. And board membership is hard work. And a director must of necessity be committed to the progress of the company and to meeting the expectations of stakeholders all the time. His or her interests must be strategically aligned to that of the company. A knowledgeable, experienced, and effective board chairman with strong leadership credentials is an important asset to any organization. There is also immense need to build trust between board and executive management in order to ensure that there is effective management in that organization. I'd also like to look at how boards operate. For instance, it's important that board papers must be concise and reach directors in good time, well ahead of meetings. This is for the members to be better prepared for the meeting. This gives directors time to familiarize themselves with all the matters to be discussed, make notes, and compile questions. It also minimizes delays at meetings, taking decisions at meetings, and making approvals. And this can affect productivity on the long run. Quite often, it's viewed as a sign of disregard for the board, for bulky documents to be sent to board members same day or only a day or two before meetings. This is usually frowned at most of the time. Board members need to get needed information to perform functions well. It is better for management if the board is sufficiently informed to be able to take right decisions. I've been emphasizing this important issue of making sure that boards are well informed and very well briefed, because that forms foundation of decision making in any modern board. And I would like to say generally that boards can only be under-briefed and cannot be over-briefed. So as much information as possible should be made available at board meetings. So a good CEO has as his responsibility to ensure full transparency with the chairman of the board and other members of the board, and ensure that they are adequately informed, especially with respect to regular financial performance, either quarterly, monthly, depending on what is agreed, of the business, and potential risk to the business. And in general, I'd like to say that the CEO will also benefit from using the chairman and board members as sounding boards for major new undertakings being planned or initiated by management, or new regulatory promulgations that may impact business performance. In concluding this my initial talk, I like to say that with the environment as it is, with the post-COVID environment and the challenges that have resulted from the lockdowns over the time and the loss of businesses and business opportunities, it may be a good time for business owners to check their boards and management structures to ensure that they are fit for purpose for this kind of difficult time that we're in. I'll stop now and we'll be happy to take questions at the Q&A segment of this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ndukwe. I will now have Mrs. Ezigbo join us. We'll have her speak now.
Okay, Hilda, thank you very much. Very good morning to everyone who is listening, my other panel members, and thank you for this invitation. Now, depending on who you are listening to, you know, we hear things like how 80% of small businesses fail in their first year, another 50% in their second year, another 80% within 5 years, and even those that make it to the 10th year, that about 70% of those businesses tend to fail. Now, this is not a Nigeria situation per se, because whether you're looking at the data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics or the UK Office of National Statistics or Canada or anywhere else, you see that there are high failure rates amongst small businesses, but they're certainly nowhere as high as we see in Nigeria and across Africa. Now, I want to start from that because, like Hilda mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, today is the 4th of June, is a very, very auspicious day for me because 26 years ago today, my husband and I opened our doors for business in Port Harcourt at 121 Biaba Road. And by the grace of God, we have been here. We've never been shut for one day. And today we're operating out of 3 locations. In this time, we've employed hundreds of Nigerians, and we've grown from a totally unknown entity into a company that is known and respected in Nigeria's gas industry today. So it is from this perspective that I'm very passionate about the topic, and I'm going to be directing my comments largely to fellow SMEs. Dr. Ndukwe has come from the perspective of all his experience culminating now in being the chairman of a multinational. So I'm going to take it from the perspective of the smaller companies along the line. So when you look at the issues that relate to failure rates amongst SMEs, there are many commonalities that you see. But one of the things that stands out across the board is the lack of institutionalization, whether it's by way of systems and structures, policies, procedures, whether it's people, technology, business strategy, and so on. But because of the topic today, I'm going to hone in on the issues of leadership and governance. And unfortunately, these are 2 areas that don't tend to get the focus that they deserve early enough in the life of most SMEs. And to be fair, it's understandable to some degree. I mean, SMEs were the drivers of economic growth. We're responsible for creating local job, building the domestic markets, and so on. But this is the global picture. In the individual capacities, most of us who are entrepreneurs, what we did was to just jump onto the entrepreneurial train. We were largely ill-informed, ill-equipped, and many times both, but certainly at least one. Now, most SMEs also are owner-managed. And most times as owners, what we bring to the table is the entrepreneurial drive and not necessarily the institution mindset. So many times funds are a constraint. So even when you're thinking in terms of how to grow the business, how to build the business, how to hire the right caliber of people on your senior leadership teams, especially in the early years, it's a bit difficult. And when you're talking about the executive management team, in most SMEs, you think of how many millions and millions there are, what you are discussing is really the people that report to the managing director, who many times is the be-all and end-all of the business. So when you talk about executive management in the sense of those who have the competency and capacity and responsibility to report upwards to the boards, many times that's not exactly in place. And speaking of boards, many times in the life of SMEs, what you find is that the setting up of boards is either it's not given any form of priority, or is done in some sort of an aesthetic manner, either by putting friends and family in place, or just people, so you can say such and such a person is on your board. And it's not something that is done with a strategic intent to add value to the business at that level. But central to our effectiveness as business leaders, and especially as owner managers, is our ability to not only establish and communicate the organization's vision, but also to establish the frameworks, the systems, and the corporate cultures that support the actualization of the vision. So if there's one thing that I know, as I said earlier, the sooner that the leader or promoter of a business venture puts in place that institutionalization framework, those building blocks that take away the person dependency elements of their business, the better assured those businesses are to survive over the long term. The earlier a business is able to set up a strong and independent board, one, and secondly, submit to the element of governance that the board will bring, the more likely also that the longer term sustainability, stability, profitability of the business is assured. Pearl Zhu, who is the author of Digitizing the Boardroom, she said that a strategic board has a view of looking ahead and insights to look deeper, and the competency to look beyond. And their role is to pull management out of the trees to see the forest. I find that very apt, because we know that most of us who are entrepreneurs running our businesses, we are really very much in the trees. We are really very much in the day-to-day, trying to make the business grow and survive on a day-to-day basis. And many times the strategic outlook is a conversation that comes up only after a few years. Your board is the supreme decision-making authority. I mean, according to section 245 of CAMA, they have many duties that are clearly laid out to promote the success of the company, a fiduciary duty to the company to observe good faith regarding the transactions, a duty of care, so many things. And so when it comes to what the requirements of the board are, they are very clearly spelled out. There are certainly some best practices from a governance point of view, which many times again, when you're looking at the SME space, you are not seeing that, even though I want to think that is changing more and more. So you're supposed to have, for instance, the separation between the positions of the CEO and the chairman. You need to keep your board and the executive management as independent as possible. What we see many times, however, is you see titles like executive chairman, or you see MD, CEO, and chairman. And many times it may sound like a powerful place to sit. But the reality for us, especially those of us who are owner managers, is that if you are the owner of the business or majority shareholder, you are the MD, you are the CEO, you are the board chairman, I promise you that your company will never get the best out of you. The person of the chairman should ideally be very independent from the company. So you need to think through, and I know Mr. Ndukwe also spoke about this. Think about who you want to put in the place of your board chairman. It's a highly strategic role that must be carefully thought through. It's also very important that you have a lot of independent non-executive directors, certainly non-executive directors, but always preferably independent, people that have no financial stake in the company. What they're bringing to you is their knowledge, their expertise, and their commitment to help you grow the business. They are bringing impartiality also, and I think this is very important. So in the course of growing my own business, I have gone through, so I'm not just speaking in the air. I've gone through at the beginning of the company, setting up a board that was mainly family and friends. And I saw how that went. And I saw when we made the transition to now saying, no, this is not working. It was actually quite difficult to disband that board. But we got to the point where we now said, we want a board that is focused on value creation and the strategic direction of the business. And that's been a huge transformation over the last about 15, 16 years. Now, as an owner manager, as an entrepreneur, and as a business coach and mentor, I'm always asked a lot of questions like, when do I need to set up a board? What kind of people should I bring on my board? How do I set up a board when I can't afford to pay directors? And of course, there's the proverbial question of, will you please sit on my board? And I'm sure we can get to some of these in the Q&A. But one of the things I want to say in terms of best practices, in terms of effective leadership, is that for those of us who are business owners, we really want to be sure that we set up boards that command our attention, boards that command our respect and our accountability. Otherwise, again, we do ourselves a disservice. Therefore, from my point of view, the effective leadership actually starts from the setup process. And the question I would have then for any entrepreneur that is listening is, are you bold enough? Are you confident enough in yourself that you can set up a board that will be able to remove you as CEO if they feel you are sub-optimizing the business? That's the kind of board you are looking for. That's the kind of board you are looking for. They must command your respect, attention, and accountability. If your board is supposed to be the highest decision-making body in your organization, with the kind of fiduciary responsibility that they carry, with the kind of exposure that they themselves are subject to just because they're on their board, then if you, the owner manager, the CEO, and your management team, your executive management team, if you don't have respect for the board or for their governance oversight, then you have a mere figurehead board that has no true bearing on the strategy, growth, and direction of the business. And I know that Mr. Ndukwe also spoke about that. There has to be a sense, and you as the leader, you are going to set the tone. The executive management will set the tone as to how important that board is in the business. In my company, for instance, anytime there is a board meeting coming up, you can literally feel that the environment is charged because people know that there is a weight the owners of the business placed on that board, whether it's in terms of reporting and accountability, and therefore the whole system is working towards delivering the best to make sure that the directors have what they need to help the business to grow forward. It's really key. Now, Mr. Ndukwe spoke to board composition, and I also just want to touch about that. I said it earlier, that you have to think about what do you want on your board. Your board is not the place for just putting people, no. You have to think it through. So if you're in a technical industry, for instance, if you are in IT, you want to be sure that you have somebody who has a bit of industry knowledge and experience, because when you start to speak the industry jargon, somebody must be able to break this down. You want to be sure on your board that you have somebody that understands finance and investment. You need people that can look at the numbers and make business sense out of it, even as you yourself as a CEO and ideally your entire executive management team should understand the numbers behind your business. You have to think about whether you need someone who is a strategist. Do you need people who are in the legal, regulatory, compliance space, and so on? Let me just share an example as to how when you don't get things right, or rather when you get things right at the board level, you know, you can sort out a lot of problems for the business itself. I was invited to chair a board a few years ago. It had been a running business, but this was the first time that the CEO decided, the business owner decided to set up a board, and she invited me to chair this board. The first time I got the documents, I went through, I'm very rigorous like that, and I could not understand something. There was a huge sum which had been treated as a rent advance. And I knew this was a startup company, and I knew they certainly didn't own any assets where anybody had paid anything in advance. So I asked the question at the meeting. You know what it was? Quite simply, it was a donation that had been given to the company for an event that they were trying to have by a sponsor. And the accountants they had then didn't know where to plug the figure. So he created something called rent advance just to make his trial balance. And this ended up in their accounts, which they were presenting to the board. The CEO too did not understand the numbers. And it took me, being a numbers person, to be able to see this and be able to speak to them about what the implications are and where we could get into trouble with the authorities later, maybe looking like we're trying to hide income. I certainly wasn't going to be in a board where tomorrow I'll be questioned for that kind of an amount. So you have to think it through. What are the competencies that you need from a business 360? You have to think about diversity. You need an inclusive board that has both male and female. And I tell you that you want a board where you can see different perspectives and results. There is an established correlation between the profitability and productivity of companies that have at least one woman on their board. And this is a global figure. Even out of the Fortune 500 company boards, you see that they said that the percentages of women rose up to 22.5% because they found that those that had women on their boards outperformed their peers by an average of 26% over some years. But I have a caveat in this regard, which is that, you know what, as we're talking about inclusiveness, please, whatever you do as a CEO, as a business owner, never put a token woman on your board. The same metrics by which you're looking for the leaders at your board level, any woman you want to put on your board must fit in. She must come with her own competence, her own capacity, and be able to hold her own on the board as is required for every single board member. Diversity also comes from the perspective of age. So you want to look at the fact that there is experience that is required, yes, but many times you also need different perspectives and different viewpoints. So you try to make sure that your board is balanced by way of age. You don't want to have too many senior people, and certainly you don't want to have too many young people, because experience and maturity will also count. And of course, thinking about how many people you want on the board, whether it should be small enough to make sense, not too big as to become a big problem in decision making. Now, in terms of leadership, so once there is a formal chairman, and I've talked a lot about that, the reality is that the chairman comes with a huge weight in terms of how the board runs and how the board is able to lead that organization. But I think it's very important that every member of the board that you put in place understands that they're fully and individually responsible for leadership at that level. And when Mr. Ndukwe was talking, Dr. Ndukwe, he also talked about the committees. So you want to be sure that because of the people that are on the board, when you set up board committees, those committees are very effective. Those committees are the ones that have the ability to do the deeper dives into the business issues and come out with results that the broader board can then sanction. So if you are a board SME, an SME with a board, you have to understand that this is not a responsibility that you can toy with. The meetings must be held quarterly. So the expectation is that the board will be demanding for those meetings. The expectation is that full reports must be given and on time, and there must be compliance reporting at that meeting. So the board is not just looking at the basics that are coming out of management, they're also looking at how the company is positioning in terms of its accountability and deliverables to stakeholders, whether by way of tax compliance, licenses and permits. Just looking at the business, like I said, is a 360. Which means, therefore, that there is an imperative for the executive management to make sure that the proper reporting frameworks are in place, to make sure that the reports are coming out on time, that they're getting to the board on time. And certainly, you owe it to your board as an owner manager, especially, to ensure that there is full disclosure and transparency. Don't hide the facts. If you make mistakes, show them to the board. They will help you to think through the strategies to get out of them. But if we are having different sets of reports to our boards as distinct from what is going on in the day-to-day, that's already setting ourselves up for failure. Now, the board must demand to see the numbers, be able to see the high-level facts behind those figures. And as I've said, even you, the CEO, the executive management team, you must understand those numbers. It is important that we give the board committees the mandate and the freedom, if they are required to do independent checks, to be able to engage with those executive management members who have a direct line of reporting to the board, especially if you're talking about things like risk and audit. Those are things that can report directly to the board. And as a business owner, you should not be trying to checkmate the reports that go there. There is a big problem when we want to grow global institutions, big businesses, but we don't want to go through the process of that institutional framework. As business owners, one of the things I always say to myself is this: if I were not the one sitting on this position, and if I had hired somebody to be the managing director of a business I've worked for all these years, what kind of level of accountability, integrity would I demand from that person? And if you do that, you find that it sort of guides and guards what it is that you're doing. Of course, we expect that you would put the kind of people on the board that will be thorough, when you submit reports to them, there will be a lot of rigor applied in their going through the documents and following through. You expect to have a board that is able to leverage on their networks and their own connections to help to facilitate any difficulties you may be facing in the businesses or connections that may need to be made. And certainly you want a board that is fully present and engaged, a board that will submit themselves to periodic evaluations so that if things are not working out, you know, you don't just keep people on your board for keeping sake because you don't want to hurt their sensitivities. That just doesn't work at all. And so even from the point of view of executive management, and I'll just sort of wrap my comments, my early comments around that, is to say that as executive management, be you the CEO or that senior leadership team, you are the highest management level. You are the ones that have the responsibility to drive the vision and the goals of the organization, to deliver on the annual budgets, to deliver on approved business plans. So when you are especially in owner-manager firms, in SMEs, it's really not unusual many times to find that the CEOs, the EDs, the CFOs, the COOs, they're either related parties or they're invested parties. And even where they are not, though, as executive management, it is important you try to find that balance between your day-to-day running of your business and the accountability to board and ultimately to your shareholders and your wider ecosystem of stakeholders. So you have to be able to depersonalize yourself from the business. Make sure you're driving compliance. Make sure you are factual, presenting facts and truth in your reporting to the board. Making sure that when the board gives directives, I think this is really key. When the board gives directives that you follow through. Many times in my engagement with people, you know, people come to you as a business owner, they want you to sign off on this, they have this proposal, can you throw 5 million at it? And you're telling them things like, no, because it's out of budget, because at the end of the day, when I go way past my budget, I have to go back and defend that budget to the board. I have to explain. Many times I hear things like, what are you saying? Is it not just you and your husband? Because people's mindset is that once you are an SME, you do things the way you like. But if, like I am, you are building a company that you want to still be here in 26 years' time, in 50 years' time, in 100 years' time, as the business owner, you really just have to submit to a higher level of diligence, to a higher level of process, to a higher level of governance, which is the framework that the board puts in place. So when a board gives a directive, even though you can say, I'm the one that appointed these people, I'm the one that is paying their sitting allowances and their annual fees and all that. No, that's really not the tone. You do yourself a disservice. It's important to follow through on the guidance and directive of your board. So I think that I want to just leave it here. And from the perspective, again, of the smaller businesses to say, look, for effective leadership of your organization, you need to, as quickly as possible, put in a sound board and be careful the kind of people you put in the board, on the board. Be careful the accountabilities they come with. Be careful that they are people that you can submit to their leadership. Be careful to be open and transparent with them, and make sure that this is the same kind of thinking and approach that the entire senior leadership team has towards the board. What it means then as the leader to make sure you're driving all your people to deliver on the requirements of the board. And then you come to this place of a nice synergistic partnership with both the board and the executive management that is able to help the company focus and drive a strategic vision in a very concise, effective manner, in a very ethical manner at that. So I'll leave it at that and be happy to take some questions later. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Hilda?
Thank you very much, Mrs. Joyce. Thank you so much. So we'll take questions at the end, like we said. So Mr. Ibobo, the floor is yours now. Thank you. Mr. Ibobo. Mr. Ibobo, the floor is yours. Can you hear me?
Okay, sorry, I just forgot to unmute. And the society for having Ezigbo. They are the boardroom experts. They have spoken. I will speak very briefly as a journalist, especially a business journalist, watching the corporate Nigeria from very close range. What we see in the media is that corporate governance is very vital and helps to set aside organizations, whether they are measured by profit, brand loyalty, and valuation, organizations that are stellar in their performance as against those mediocre peers that we see on an ongoing basis. Challenges. As a journalist, I find that practice in reality diverges quite often from the rules and the norms, diverges from the expectation. Corporate governance has to go beyond organograms. Corporate governance has to go beyond documents. We find that in a country like Nigeria, where there is such a hierarchical nature in our customs, and this very, deep-rooted deference to the man in charge, or if you like, Oga at the top, we find this seeping, inescapably into organizations, into their management, as well as their boardrooms. So that's a major challenge that we see, a challenge that is associated with our society at large, a challenge that is born in our customs and our traditions. As a journalist, I also believe that corporate governance is nuanced on many levels. Investors in Nigeria are becoming quite informed, quite knowing, you find that there is a perception suggesting that multinationals or conglomerates, or those that are listed on the exchange, are expected to be better run, even if this is not always the case, because we see from time to time disappointing turn of events. I think the comforting thing that you can say about the conglomerates and the multinationals and the listed firms is that these breaches, these movement away from the rule book are very promptly identified and resolved. So that for me is quite comforting. Now, further, we have seen a number of wholly indigenous companies, whether they are listed or whether they aren't, that are holding their own when it comes to corporate governance. And for me, this offers us significant promise, because we as a journalist, we don't think that Nigerians are different as business managers from around the world. Often they are attending the same schools, taking the same courses, and we're expecting that they should go into the businesses that they run and manage those businesses and create value for the various stakeholders of the business. It is also important at this point to mention the very critical role that the media expects of the regulators that are appointed by government. Because as I said earlier, one of the reasons why listed companies and conglomerates are better able or better prepared or better willing to resolve breaches or infractions when they happen is simply because of the reporting standards that they are associated with. And for me, that really says a lot about the expectation of regulators. The recent saga involving a large company and the regulator and Exchange Commission, that the saga happened, it is perhaps the failure or the inability for it to be so promptly resolved. When the media sees the use of political power to benefit, the media expectedly gets very excited. And you see front pages littered with narratives of what is happening. The danger here is that it promotes significant value erosion, puts the investment climate or the investment environment of the country in bad light, and sends a very bad, damaging message about the country and about its ability and willingness to protect badly investment when that investment comes. And so we believe that regulators have to be smart. Regulators have to be up to par. Regulators themselves should not just preach enthronement of best practices in companies or organizations that they regulate. They themselves must also best practice in their own. And I think there is a lot that government itself can do here. When, for instance, you leave a regulator without a board or a complete board for a year or even longer, it sends a very bad message. And these are very salient points that the regulators and the government, as it were, must take into consideration. The media believes that we do not have to wait for every 5 years or every 10 years when you would have a radical campaigning regulator come, like Lamido Sanusi came many years ago and rooted out perceived malfeasance in the financial sector. We think that watching the environment, watching the sectors by the regulators has to be an ongoing business, not to create bottlenecks for the sectors or for the businesses for them to operate in, but simply to debottleneck the process, to create the belief and assurance that rules are being enforced and that there is compliance to the highest levels expected. That with good, smart regulation, we would stand a chance of eroding or reducing excesses in sectors, because, as it were, there are other stakeholders beyond the management, the board, and just the narrow community of investors or owners. Interestingly, in the media, beginning to see smaller companies also do well when it comes to corporate governance. And my immediate past speaker, Mrs. Ezigbo, has spoken very eloquently on what small businesses can do, just as big businesses do as well, because there's that expectation today. We're finding small businesses that are taking investment as well as big, large corporations do. So there is that expectation that there will be value protection. The key point here to be made about the character of directors that are appointed into boardrooms the expectation of the shareholders. Another thing or trend that we are seeing, especially among small businesses, is the growing impact being made by private equity firms or venture capital firms. We're seeing that their infusion into small businesses is bringing not only the badly needed capital, but is also bringing significantly non-monetary values like better corporate governance practices. That's key. We have in Business Day chronicled quite a number of such organizations and the impact made in adherence and compliance simply on account of the entry of a private equity firm or a venture capital firm that has invested in the organization and taken a place in the boardroom. Interestingly, you find that today there is a growing awareness, and not only of corporate governance rules, but also of their importance and how it is that they are not only just rules to be adhered to, but also tools for ensuring corporate sustainability of organizations. And I think for me, that's important, because we find that many organizations that we see in the business landscape today were founded 20, 30 years ago. And increasingly, the owners of the businesses are beginning to think about life after they pass on. What kind of business they are able to leave behind. And I think that is one of the things that is driving the improvement that we see in small businesses. The country is littered with quite a number of big names of the past that we only can remember today by way of names, not by way of life. Life has been taken out of them simply because of some of the mistakes that their owners and their managers made. And I think what we see today is that business managers are beginning to ask themselves questions around how they can avoid some of these mistakes and how their businesses can survive them. They see that the risk grows in owner-managed businesses, and so they have to put in place measures to mitigate these risks and to ensure that there is transparency, there is proper governance, there is proper stakeholder engagement, and of course, as I said earlier, ensure that their businesses are positioned for the future. These business owners are beginning to see and to accept the positive correlation there is between corporate governance in the organizations and the long-term sustainability of their businesses. And as I said earlier, this means a growing adoption of best practices. It means, appointing credible people to their boards. It means putting in place other structures to ensure that they give their businesses a better chance of long-term survival. I think there is also, from a media perspective, what we see a growing hunger of business owners, that's owners of small businesses, to ensure value aggregation and value protection. And I think one must identify here what is clearly the role that better education is playing. The fact that the Lagos Business School has been around now for years, focusing on these same issues, helping to train managers and retrain owners of businesses, they have their owner manager program and similar other programs that, in our view in the media, are helping to create a well-prepared regime of people who are going into senior management or going into boards of organizations. I think it is also important that I make a point here. The media is not only just an institution to chronicle the compliance with or adherence of best practices, including corporate governance in organizations. The media itself also has the duty and the responsibility as a business to abide by these same rules and these same expectation if they themselves must live by the same rules that they insist that others live by. And I would close by just giving a small example of what we have tried to do at in the last 13 years. Of course, we have a board of directors, but we reasoned 13 years ago that the business had two ways of really looking at itself. There is the commercial side of the business, but there is also the journalism side of the business. So with the help of a very good man, Dick Kramer, we established an editorial advisory board, which meets more often than the board of directors will meet, and is specifically focused on just holding our journalists to account when it comes to our journalism, because that is the biggest platform that we have to engage the public beyond the commercial side of the business. And this editorial advisory board is made of very senior people in society, well-respected business leaders, investors, university teachers who handhold our people, audit the work that we do, and ensure that management imposes sanctions where there are infractions, but most importantly, it is to ensure that there is improved governance in our journalism that helps to avoid breaches rather than correct them after they have happened. And I can testify here that that has been a significant feature that distinguishes Business Day. And I must say that today in Nigeria, Business Day is the only media organization that I know that has such a credible, independent editorial advisory board helping to shape the journalism of our people. I think I will pause here, knowing that there is a time limit. And of course, like other speakers, take questions if there are any questions from the. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. We will take questions now. I'm going to take the questions that have been sent through the question and answer icons. I know some people have sent in their questions via the chat platform. Would appreciate if you can type the questions again in the question and answer using the question and answer icon. If you want any of our discussants to specifically answer your questions, you can indicate that. However, if you've not indicated, I'm just going to throw the question open and choose or decide which speaker is going to take the question. So I have the first one here, which is specifically for Dr. Ernest Njikwe. On providing information for board members, what happens where the chairman and maybe a select few in the board request for information, financial or otherwise, just to have an edge over other board members? What should the CEO do? Give same information to other board members or not? That's for you, sir, Dr. Ernest Njikwe.
Okay, thank you for that question. I'm not sure I've come across that kind of issue before, where some board members want to have edge over the other board members. But the usual practice is that what is circulated to one should be circulated to everyone. Sometimes the chairman of the board, because the chairman of the board is there in between meetings and may want to get some specific information on certain things that are going on. Of course, that can be requested and that should be supplied. But the company secretary has a role to play in that area, where if the information is such that other board members will benefit from, that she requests from the chairman to pass it on to as many people as possible. But quite honestly, a board where you have some members wanting to have edge over other members of the board is a suspicious board, because quite honestly, a board should be such that people respect each other and able to work collaboratively to ensure things are done well. Because at the end of the day, the main thing is that the board is there for the interests of the company, not for personal interests of any sort. So quite honestly, those don't happen quite often. And when it happens, the CEO should be able to take initiative and make sure that the information is passed to all members of the board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. The next question is for Mrs. Jo Ezigbo. The question says that as a governance professional seeking to make a difference, how can we convince the SME owners to embrace enterprise governance as a way of life and not a business burden? The person asking the question says she would appreciate very practical answers. I'm sorry, your microphone is...
Yes,
okay.
I'm muted and you muted. All right, thank you for that question. Very, very cogent question indeed, because, you know, like I said, in that SME space, you are usually dealing with owner managers. And many times, because they are not seeing the benefits, they are looking at the board as a constraint. People don't want to be told what to do. And as you know, especially in Nigeria, we have what we call the Oga mentality. Even your security man at the gates doesn't play with his, his position there. So many times you find that people don't want a body that tells them what they can or cannot do. That's the way they see it. And some other people just see it as an unnecessary cost. However, the SME space is very broad. So while there would always be those who will not come on board, there is also a nice crop of evolving people who have run their businesses for some time and they are open to growth. More and more as venture capital and private equity has become a norm in our landscape, you're also finding that people recognize that if certain structures and systems are not in place, then they may not get the partners that they need. So it's really about looking at the space, looking at who you are targeting, and then beginning to do the sell in terms of the trainings. In terms, you can offer service for free, for instance, to start with, just to open the door. You can have a governance training you offer to a corporate, just to give them an idea of what the benefits are, what the framework is like, how it's supposed to run, and so on and so forth. So it is not as difficult as it seems if you target. If you're just trying to offer broadly to SMEs, I promise you many are not interested in listening. So you have to look for that space. Look for how you partner with organizations like the Society of Corporate Governance. Frank also talked about LBS and many other establishments that are looking at the governance space. If you yourself are a governance professional, can you put together some kind of a training or learning session in this era where we're doing, every time you turn around, there's a webinar that is relevant to some element of business. Can you create those kind of free platforms, invite people to come? Again, it's a targeted audience, and then see what you offer to them in terms of learning and capacity building. So that's really what it is. But I find that it really takes a lot for people to mature into the right kind of board. Some people just tell you, I already have a board and it ends there. But to be able to shape their thinking, you have to be able to show the benefits of having the right kind of board as against just having a board or no board at all. Okay? It's not as straightforward. I can engage with you one-on-one, but it's really not that straightforward. And it's a huge market, a very diverse market. So you have to be targeted.
Thank you very much, Ma. The next question is going to be for you, sir, Mr. Frank Aibogo. There's a missing link between effective leadership and corporate governance, especially in public corporations in Nigeria. How can this missing link be mitigated to ensure that you have a robust board that is put in place, minding our peculiarities, that is religious peculiarities, quota system and all? How do you mitigate this missing link between effective leadership and corporate governance in public corporations in Nigeria?
Well, thank you very much. I think in the end, it will depend on the courage. It will also depend on the expectations of the promoters of the business. What do they want? Ultimately, the character of the people that you appoint to senior management, appoint to boards, will hold very large in the boardroom and in the management of those organizations. The structures that you have put in place to ensure proper monitoring of what goes on in the organization through a very strong reporting framework that has been set up. My experience as a journalist is, this is not just an experience really. If you look at what happens in the world today, there is a very strong correlation, very direct correlation between the best 10 societies and the best 10 societies with free press and free and best practices in the press. And when you extract, what I extract from that is where you have a place where you have significant light coming into an environment, the darkness appears to recede. So when you have strong reporting frameworks, then infractions and malfeasance will reduce. So for me, that is significant. But I think ultimately it would be what is it that the promoters of the business want? What they know? Do they know that governance helps them, owners of the business, someone else? Or do they see corporate governance as strictures that should be avoided as possible? And the character of the directors and of the senior management, I think is really important. So the courage of the promoters to define what they seek, what their objectives are, what their desires are, I think underpins all of this. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mrs. Ezigbo, would you like to shed a bit more light on that question? The person asking the question would also like you to give a take on it, ma'am.
Yeah, so I think I will agree with Frank, and primarily the last point that he made about what are the owners of the business looking at, right? It's about your objectives, about your outlook. So if I take myself as an example, in setting up my company, I was always clear that I wanted to build something that was going to outlive me, something that was not, you know, in fact, even when you think about succession, I have never been one of those that believes that succession is about my children are coming to take over the business. It has always been about, I want to build something that somewhere in future they will say, oh, you know, there was this woman and this man, they're the ones that started this big business we're seeing today. So it depends on what your outlook is as business owners, and you find that the frameworks you put in place, the things you submit to, and the things you project as business owners have a way of shaping and informing the decisions that you take, the board you set up, your accountability to the board, and so on. So really, it's a big part of what is the outlook from an owner-manager perspective. Every business will at least start from an owner-manager point of view, no matter how it grows in the long run. Yeah. So I think Frank made some very good points in that regard. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Ndukwe, I'd like you to take the next question. This person says that Nigeria has a slippery path for investors and companies when it comes to rates, levies, whether officer determined or official levies, efficiency of government institutions, and so on. We are here now. Prior to this time, logistics for a meeting such as this would have been costly and time consuming, not to talk about its effectiveness. So where do we begin to correct regulatory oversight where it concerns some of these processes and efficiency of government institutions? Your microphone is muted, sir.
They say necessity is the mother of invention. It's actually amazing the other day when we were considering how much government agencies and corporates have saved over this period of lockdown and the pandemic. Quite honestly, many meetings that hitherto people thought were not possible, like board meetings, even in churches where you have Bible studies and things like that. It's amazing how much people are able to actually link up from different parts of the country and from different parts of the world to a meeting of a corporate organization, and even in government where even Federal Executive Council meetings are held virtually. I think that has come to stay. And I must say that is the new normal today. I doubt if many people will go back to the old time when you have costly travels and hotels for meetings that can easily be held virtually. So, like I said, this has come to stay. I think I'll also like to quickly add my voice to the issue about corporate boards and government boards, that the question that was asked earlier. I have a feeling that a lot of changes need to happen within government. Sometimes boards are dissolved and not reconstituted for over a year or two. And these are very important organizations. For instance, in those days of NITEL, sometimes they dissolved the board of NITEL. And NITEL was a multi-billion dollar, not naira, much, what my word, NITEL at that time was a multi-billion dollar organization. And you dissolve the board and it doesn't have a board. And what happens is they appoint the minister to be the chairman and decides what happens in the board of directors of a big company like that. So a change, a drastic change needs to happen. It's still happening today where government boards of very major institutions are not properly constituted in due time. Meanwhile, we have a country with over 200 million people and many very competent and celebrated people who can be on such boards and pilot them to do good things for the country. So whatever happens, I hope government is listening. It's important that when boards are removed, and I would actually dare say that boards should never be removed unless there is another board to take over that board. And it's also not good practice to remove all board members of a board at the same time. There should be some rotation in removal, because especially when such boards are for organizations that are though government, but like NNPC, Nigerian Communications Commission, they are government boards, but quite honestly, their impact on the society is so enormous that you don't just wake up and remove boards without replacing them almost immediately. It's so important that government adheres to this for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question is for Mrs. Ezigbo. What practical approach can be adopted by a SME business that has no capacity or resources to set up a board of directors that is separate from the management team? What practical approach can such SME adopt in entrenching corporate governance ethics into the business in the short, medium, and long term?
Okay, so two things. So I hear one part about the resources in setting up a board, and I hear another thing about establishing a corporate governance framework. I want to take them separately, though they are very interrelated. First of all, as SMEs, we always tend to assume that setting up a board is expensive. And I don't know why that is. Yes, certainly, ideally, you should be paying people sitting allowances and annual fees for dedicating their time. I mean, time is a resource, and you translate that to money, right? However, reality is that as your business is growing, it is not impossible, and I say this because I've experienced it, to find people, seasoned people that you can have a conversation with, share your vision with, and get them to commit their time to serving on your board to help you to grow the business. It is done, and you just make sure that your meetings are comfortable, you provide lunch for them, you respect their time, make sure you treat them with value, and help them to know that in coming to work with you, they're not wasting their time, that you really respect their opinions. It is very possible. There are many people out there who can serve. Again, we should have gone past the era of thinking we must have some big names on our boards. It's not about the names, it's about the value that people bring. So it may not be anybody, any name that is known like that, but there are people that come with the competencies, and there are many people who are willing to serve. There are many people who have retired from your industry that are looking for ways to add value, for instance, and you can bring these people in. So I think let's first of all get that out of the way, that when you start to think I may need a board to help me grow my business, it's not always a naira and kobo conversation. Okay, let's just understand that. Now, secondly, even if you decide that, okay, I'm not ripe for a board, or I don't want to have a board in place until I'm able to put, even if it is a 50,000 naira sitting allowance on the table, then internally, the metrics for corporate governance are very clear. It is one, in terms of the accountability you yourself have to the business. What kinds of things do you allow? What kind of systems and structures have you put in place? Policies have you put in place? And you yourself, are you faithful to those things? If you're an owner manager and you take the time with your management team to create policies, to create systems, and you are the first to breach them, then obviously you are not sending the message down across your teams in the office, okay? So you are the first person that will stand up to say, okay, in this company, we are going to be fully compliant in terms of our taxes. This is our policy on this. We will not breach this. This is the kind of reporting that is expected, and so on and so forth. And you set the tone. There are so many frameworks that you can decide to adopt for your business. Make sure your SOPs are clearly mapped out. Make sure that you have systems for dealing with people who go out of process. Make sure there's an accountability framework that is in place, and so on and so forth. So it's really about what kind of business do you want to run? And I really feel that as a business owner, what I said earlier is critical. Wear the hat and ask yourself, if I didn't own this business and I hired an MD, what are my expectations? Would I expect that MD to dip into company profits and buy himself a new car? Would I expect that MD MD to take money from the company and take his family for summer? Would I expect that MD to not prepare any reports and just tell me, oh, the business is doing well? Is that what you would expect? Would I expect that MD, if we're trying to pursue a project, not to do the rigor of doing the industry analysis, looking at the competitive framework, looking at the risks and opportunities, looking at the funding aspects? And so would you expect an MD you are paying to just come to you and talk about the business, or would you expect them to put things in place that can come and convince you that they know what they are doing and you can put your resources behind it? If you wear that mindset, you would demand the same of every one of your executive managers, and you would demand the same of the system. What kind of performance management system do you operate? For instance, do you even take time to set your corporate goals? You know, you have the broad vision yet, but you have to be able to set annual goals and break them down so that everybody has deliverables and they're being measured and they're being tracked. Okay, then what do you do when people do, if there's fraud or somebody is found to be colluding with a vendor? How do you deal with such cases? Or are you the same person who is even doing that and then you come and be speaking ethics to your staff? So it's really about the tone at the top, the tone of ownership, the tone of the MD CEO. Even if there is no board, there are certain things you can do to create a strong governance framework. Make sure you're paying your taxes. Make sure you have all your licenses and permits, and you're not cutting corners. And you will see the system will adjust more than, at least, if not 100%, more than 90%, you will have a good framework that is in place. Okay? And make sure you document them, because it's about institution building. Document and chart all your processes. All right, thank you. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Ma. Thank you, Ma. My next question is for Dr. Ernest Ndukwe. What advice would you give to a board with a very poor performing member? A member that has absolutely nothing to offer the board. What advice would you give to the board to handle such a member? Dr. Ndukwe, sir.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. And it's always a question that affects a number of boards around the country, actually, and internationally. That is where the issue of board evaluation comes in. Usually, some regulatory requirements insist that the board evaluates itself from time to time. And in bigger companies, they actually hire the services of some companies to help them provide questionnaires that help them come out with a report that is usually submitted to the chairman of the board about the activities of board members and how board members rate themselves. For a board member that performs below expectation on a consistent basis, that's why in my initial presentation, I talked about board members who are unable to meet the expectations of the board, either because they don't have the requisite knowledge, or they don't have the time, or they are just not interested, that such people should normally voluntarily resign and leave. But if they don't, it now behoves the chairman of the board to quietly discuss the board appraisal with the particular subject candidate and be able to suggest to the person that the person should exit. For smaller companies, it's probably easier in that, like Audrey was talking about owner managers and things like that. Board members have tenures, especially for quoted companies. You go every 2 years to renew the mandate of shareholders for that board. So if somebody has not performed well, then the shareholders will not re-elect the person for another term in the board. I think that's the smoothest way of easing out a board member. But like I said before, a chairman could also meet a board member that is not performing, discuss the issues with the person. Sometimes the board member rejuvenates. But if that doesn't happen, the board member might be quietly advised to resign and leave the board.
Thank you, sir. Mrs. Ezigbo, the next two questions, you have partly answered them in the questions you have taken earlier, but I'm just going to read them again if there's anything you want to add. Kindly explain how an SME which is managed by the owner can constitute a board, and what practical steps can an SME or a small business take that is easy and convenient to set up good governance structures? If you still like to add anything, I know you've answered most of this question in the previous ones, but.
Yes, I actually think that I've spoken quite extensively to that question. Yeah. So the issue of constituting a board, I said, you know, maybe just to repeat, because I see at least two people asking around this, is to ask yourself, what do you need on your board? What kind of competencies? You know, ideally try to find people that have some understanding about your industry, right? Especially if you're in very technical spaces. You don't want, you know, a board that you make presentations and everybody's quiet because they really don't know what you're talking about. So you need some people, one or two, that understand your industry. You need to have people that understand finance, the investment landscape, business valuation, and all those things. You need to find people who are governance experts. That also helps. Look for people who have legal, regulatory compliance. I mean, just think through your business and think through the vision and ask yourself, what do I need? What kind, if I needed to bring a think tank together to help me fashion this business moving forward, what are the competencies I need? And then in doing that, you want to look at balancing. You want to balance gender, male and female, competent, capable people. You want to look at age diversity and so on and so forth. And I said it was really key, especially when you own the business and when you are the lead CEO, so it's owner managed, that you put people you can respect. Okay, you have to put people that can question you, people that can speak up, people that can challenge you, and in fact, people that, you know what, I remember back several years ago, when I was preparing for board meetings, one person said to me one day, why are you always so, like you are on edge? Is it not your board? And I said to them, if you understand that I don't go to the board thinking, is it not those people I'm paying? No, I go to the board like I'm going to report to my authority. I'm prepared. You know, and of course, thinking about your chairman, I remember at that point in time, my chairman is late now. Just when he even sits down at a meeting and puts his papers on the table, you can see there's comments in green, there are comments in red. Your heart will first skip a bit because you prepared those reports. You know, so he himself was rigorous and you had to be equally rigorous. So think about that, because if your board can't challenge you, if they can't guide you, then there is no point. You just leave it at that, okay? So please, I mean, I don't want to repeat. I want to believe this webinar might be shared, the materials will be shared, so you can hear the things I've said earlier. Okay, so thank you for
Thank you, Ma. The next question is for you, sir, Mr. Aibogo. What's your take on people who have media experience, especially those who are industry retirees? What's your take on having them on the board as investigators and reporters?
Thank you so much. Not very clear. It would depend, in my view, on what kind of business are you talking about. There are businesses where you can find such skills in maybe accountants or similar other people. So I don't think that is something that resides only with journalists. So if you are appointing a journalist to a board, a retired journalist, shouldn't just be the fact that he's a journalist. You have to think about his character. You have to think about his preparation for that position, his exposure, and his understanding of the business and especially of the sector as well, and the broader environment in which the business is operating. And again, he has to be someone that you are looking up to play this role in this, with distinction. I think for me, that's more important, whether he's a journalist or whether he's a doctor. Of course, it's important what his profession is, assuming, as you said, he's retired. But I think there are other qualifications that may serve the organizations better than just a simple fact that this fellow is a retired journalist.
Okay, thank you, sir. My next question is for you, sir, Dr. Ernest Ndukwe. How can one balance the role of the board and the responsibilities of the executive management in an environment where the board disregards the contributions of the executive management and deliberately attempts to usurp management functions?
Thank you very much. Good question. Definitely in a good organization, the board must never usurp the functions of management. The board meets quarterly, sometimes a bit more often, depending on the kind of business. But the day-to-day management of the organization rests squarely with the chief executive and management of the organization. And in my presentation, I had talked about the importance of selecting the managing director very carefully. Because if the managing director is not competent, that is when you have people looking over his shoulders. I used to work for a multinational company that had various subsidiaries. And what the group chairman did was that he appointed managing directors to the various subsidiary businesses, of course, through their various boards, but leaves them to operate freely, but they must report the activities on a regular basis. And that the only time he intervenes is when the people are falling short of their expectations or their budgets and things like that. And that's when the board might need to come in and, do something about encouraging the management or even replacing the chief executive of that organization if there is a continuous performance deficit. But quite honestly, for a management that is doing well, such a management is usually continuously, if it's a good board, is usually continuously being encouraged and praised by the board in terms of its delivery on its mandate and what it's supposed to do. When there is problem, it's usually when the management is not delivering what it's supposed to do. The other issue which might come up, and that might be what the person asking this question might be referring to, is if it's a board that is looking to benefit from the organization rather than being board members looking at how to manage the business of the organization properly. That board is not worth its name, because there must be proper separation between board, which will usually operate at a strategic level and at a macro level of running the business, rather than on the micro level of running the business. So usually the shareholders will come up at that particular point in time and be able to use whatever means they have to correct the situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I have somebody here whom I would like him to give a take on the next question. Professor Fabian Ajogu is a senior advocate of Nigeria and is a professor of corporate governance. And I have a question here that seems quite tricky, so I'd like him to share his take on the question. I'm going to read it out whilst he gets ready to answer it. The challenge of conflict of interest seems to be a recurring decimal with going concern across the world, notwithstanding the governance rules in place. Board members have devised clever ways of circumvention. Is there anything the company, regulators, or the board can do differently or put in place to forestall this? Right after Professor Ajogu answers, I would like Mrs. Ezigbo to also share her take on the question.
Oh, well, thank you very much. My take was that I was a student listening to very interesting contributions from our eminent panelists, Dr. Ndukwe, Mrs. Joy Ezigbo, and Mr. Ibogum. Excellent professionals in their field. Please be aware. Disconnected. Now, what I think is fairly simple on the subject. I think that conflict of interest is something which continues to evolve as a function of basic human nature and interest in other things. It cannot be totally eliminated. It just needs to be managed in a way that, A, the golden rule is avoided, and if you cannot avoid it, to disclose it and follow the protocols for handling it, such that you don't undermine your credibility in discharging the trust placed upon you by a certain set of stakeholders, confusing it with the other for another set of stakeholders. So avoid it, rule number one, and if you cannot, disclose it and follow the protocols. I think it's at the heart of corporate governance, and it's at the heart of the fiduciary relationship that board members are required to have. It's called the stewardship model, and I find ways in terms of the quality of board members, in terms of the quality of reporting, practical examples from the speakers who have all walked the talk in different ways. Both in the public sector, private sector, they walk the talk of living out that fiduciary. And I need not say more, but to thank you for the surprise question, and I hope that I've been able to answer fractions of it, hopefully all. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Ezigbo.
All right, thank you. So thanks, Fabian, and great to see you. Here's my take on it. When you're discussing board members that have devised clever ways of circumvention, as I see in the chat, in the question and answer section, is that in the first place, then that means that you have the very wrongest of boards in place. And that also then tells me that even the leadership of the business has a huge question mark over their heads. And that's the reality. So as the management of the company, if you are owner managed or even if you're not owner managed, and if you're doing the right things, and then at the board level, there are issues, that's a different conversation. But when you're talking about collusion between the board and the executive management to get past what is the governance requirements, then the whole system is flawed. And I think that's where the problem is. It's about the ethics of the business. It's about the ethics of the people behind the business. And in the early introductory presentation by Dr. Ndukwe, he talked about things about the capacity of the people that you're bringing in, their character as well, being critical. So you want to ask yourself if your entire board will collude, and I know it does happen, but again, those are the metrics of a totally flawed system. It's not a system of integrity. The thing then for you as a business owner, again, remember this is the hats that I've chosen to wear today. As a business owner, what is your value system? What kind of business are you running? I am focused on ethics and integrity. I believe that my primary accountability as a business owner is to God and not to man. And I always tell people that you can literally die at your desk. And God forbid that the last thing I should have signed off on is something fraudulent. You know, I don't want to be explaining that to God. So that's my first accountability. What that means, therefore, is that in putting a board together, one of the core metrics is the character of the people, is their integrity, is their value system. So that you can't have certain types of conversation at management level. You certainly can't have them in my company, and certainly you will not be discussing them at board level. Okay, so I think this is what it comes back to. As business owners, check yourself, check what you're really putting out there. What kind of business do you want to run? What kind of metrics do you want to run it by? And then make sure that your board also has a representation of those same sets of values. How they deal with other people, because we have challenges. Of course, there are corrupt regulators too and all that, but that's not my lens, and it should not be your lens. So I'm more interested in your individual accountability, your individual determination to do business the right way, okay, and set up the right kind of board. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. The next question is for Dr. Ndukwe. You talked about building trust between the board and the management. What role can the company secretary play if there's too much mistrust, as it were, a personality clash between the chair of the board and the MD/CEO?
Very good question. What must play here is everybody being aware of his or her own responsibility. And there's nothing as good as a dialogue where people sit and they're able to talk things over. I'm happy you mentioned the company secretary. Company secretary is a very important factor in a board and management relationship. And a good company secretary would be able to make sure that she reports to both management and the board in such a way that clashes don't happen. What chairman of board would frown out is actually having to hide things from the board. Like I said, transparency is of utmost importance, because when that doesn't happen, then the board is not in a position to deliver its mandate properly. The management, on the other hand, would also like to be left alone to run their business the way they should. But they must realize at any point in time that they are accountable to the board of directors of the company. Because actually, in many respects, if not for the idea of owner-manager situations, even for that, the management is actually accountable to the board of directors. So if there is a good relationship, that is as a result of the fact that the managing director of the organization is as transparent as can be in terms of it in relation to the relationship with the board. There was a company that when I became the chairman of the board, in my first meeting with the managing director, he actually told me that I was free to chat with any member of the executive management directly. And what that told me immediately was that this is a managing director who is transparent and had nothing to hide. Because there are some MDs that take very serious exceptions when you talk to any member of staff in the organization. And that is not a good practice. Because even as board committee chairman, you interact with heads of departments of the organization. And you're able to get first-hand information, especially as the company gets bigger. The MD does not have all the information that is required for decision-making at any point in time. So sometimes the board committee chairman or the board committee members might need to go a bit lower down to the CEO to get as much information as required. Because at the end of the day, if it's a good board and a good management, their collective interest is the interest of the organization. And once that happens, then there should be no clash anywhere, because they should actually strengthen each other. In my presentation, I also suggested that board members and chairmen of boards should be used as sounding boards to management and the CEO for new things that they want to get into. Sometimes you're embarrassed as a member of board when you hear that an organization is embarking on a major action without any board member being aware that such a thing was happening. And it might be something that is in the public realm that might have effect on the company. So going back to the question, I think the company secretary must be on the lookout to make sure that the board is well briefed as much as possible and points to the managing director of the organization any point that is required in terms of how to make sure that the board is well informed, and also can actually even talk to the board chairman if she notices that there is areas of conflict that needs to be sorted out so that the thing is nipped in the bud before it festers. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Don't go yet. The next question is also for you. Is it possible to remove a non-performing director who is also a majority shareholder? And how do you go about this?
I think Audrey should help out in answering that question. I had actually talked a bit about how to remove a board member, but I must say immediately that it's a very tall order to remove such a board member if the person is a majority shareholder. Majority shareholder means that it is in his interest that the company is well run. And quite honestly, if that board member is there for the sake of making sure that things go well, then maybe he's performing his duty as a major shareholder in the organization. So it's a very tall order. But I tell you something, it happens often in the US. You might hear of the founder of Apple, Steve Jobs. The board actually removed him from the company at a particular point in time when they thought that his direction was not acceptable to them, especially a company that had other people, investors that were not tech companies as such, but investors that brought in their money in order to prop up the organization. So that can happen. But eventually, Steve went out, set up another company, and ultimately came back, was invited into the company when he became even more mature, because that time he was removed, he was still a very young man and had all kinds of weird ideas. But he came back to the board because vision is very important in looking at the progress of any organization. And he came back with a lot of vision, a lot of impact, and actually grew Apple to what we all know it is today. So it's possible for majority shareholders to be asked to step aside, especially if the board members comprise of strategic investors that are looking at making sure that this company is stable and is run well. But quite honestly, I'll be more concerned about the managing director of the organization than a majority shareholder who is not necessarily contributing heavily to what is going on at board level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Ndukwe. We have so many questions, and because of our time, we'll not be able to take all of them. But just one final question, and this has to do with board membership of a government enterprise or a government parastatal. It is perceived as being political compensation in this climate. What do you have to say about that?
I think somebody mentioned it earlier and talked about even federal character and all that. I am somebody who believes that there is no part of the country where you don't have stars. What we call federal character in Nigeria is actually rent giving and selecting relatives to occupy positions of government, rather than seeking out the competent people in that particular area of the country to occupy a position. Secondly, I think doing board membership as political compensation is a very bad way to actually ensure that boards contribute their quota in the growth of that organization. So it should be seriously frowned at, and as much as possible, people should go out. When we had our first board at the Nigerian Communications Commission, the head of state took his time to actually look around and selected very competent people from around the country into the first board of the Nigerian Communications Commission. And I think that contributed to the stellar performance the organization had, because people there were not there because of what they'll get from the organization, but they were there because of what the background knowledge they had, the contributions they'll make to the development of that organization. So it's a mixed bag, but I think having to lay emphasis on political patronage is something that should be discouraged as much as possible, especially in critical parastatal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, everybody, for being part of today's webinar. I'd just like to state here that questions, the questions we've not been able to take so far will be sent to our speakers via email, and their response will also be shared with everybody that has been part of the webinar. So we're rounding up now, and on behalf of the board of the Society for Corporate Governance Nigeria, I would like to sincerely thank our speakers, Dr. Ernest Ndukwe. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Mrs. Audrey Jo Ezigbo, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much. And Mr. Frank Aigogo, thank you so much, sir, for always being there for us. Every time we call you, you respond. Thank you so much for being here for us today. I'd also like to thank you for all you do outside of here to support the society. Thank you very much, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank board members of the society who took time to join us this afternoon. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. A few things came up about regulatory compliance, and I'd like to tell us that on June 18, we'll be discussing with regulators about the changing dynamics on regulatory compliance with respect to the global pandemic. And so if you can join us, then we'll send out information about this program by next week, or later, by next week. So we look forward to having everybody prepare their questions and prepare to discuss fully with us on that day. Also, we're sending out links for assessments to help us serve you better. So we'd like you to please fill out the form and tell us how you think we've performed, how our speakers have done, so that going forward we'll be able to serve you better. So thank you very much, everyone, and we look forward to having you on our subsequent webinars. Enjoy the rest of your day.